Welcome back, everyone. The title of my presentation today is Geonim and the Jewish Academies, Unlocking Coded References. We start by listening to this ayah from the Qur'an. The Qur'an has a strange reference to the jinn. Say, O Prophet, it has been revealed to me that a group of jinn listened to the Qur'an and said to their fellow jinn, "Indeed, we have heard a wondrous recitation." Now, typically when we hear these words and read these words, we assume that the jinn here is literally referring to spiritual beings. We've all heard this. And this makes sense because in Arabic traditions, going way back before Islam, there was a belief in jinn, which are these angelic beings that are kind of mischievous and so forth. But we're assuming that the Qur'an is actually being literal here, and we are assuming that it's straightforward and it's not referring to any other group. Why would a group of angelic beings listen to the Qur'an? Sounds like something humans would do. It's certainly anthropomorphic. That should raise some red flags, perhaps, in terms of how we've assumed what these words mean. So we're going to go on a bit of a journey. We're going to be looking at this group called the Geonim. That's the plural, or Geon, who are the religious leaders in the Jewish Academies. Now, we've looked at the Jewish Academies previously, and we're returning to them again. I think it's a good time to come back to them and have a second look, third look even. So, buckle in. We're going on a bit of a journey. We're going to explore unexplored thoughts, make uncomfortable associations perhaps, certainly free-flowing thoughts and ideas, and let's say free-flowing consciousness perhaps, and maybe something is going to bounce out at us. So with that, let's get stuck in.
Let us now transition to Babylonia, which will become the gravitational center of the Jewish world within a very short order, after the year 219, which is when Rav, a great scholar, arrived in the region after having studied in Israel. He was actually a native to Babylonia, went to Israel to study, came back, and was very much involved in establishing educational standards there. And by the way, this overemphasis perhaps on the role of one particular person, Rav, that particular rabbi, is based on the traditional scholarship, which really dates from the 9th and 10th century, and we rely very heavily on that to understand this otherwise very poorly documented period. But what we can say with absolute confidence is that Babylonia becomes such an important center in the centuries that follow his arrival in the region. So let's just do a little bit of background on the political reality. The period that represents the golden age of the Jews of Babylonia in the development of the Talmud is a period when the Parthian Empire falls to the Sasanian Empire. That's in the year 224 of the Common Era and beyond. Again, we don't know very much about the region before 219 in particular. That's when we begin to have documentation from the Talmud itself, but also from the Geonic authorities like Rav Shvira Gaon, who wrote really the first Talmudic history to describe what was going on in the region at the time. It's a period of Zoroastrian resurgence, especially during the rule of Shpur Malka, Shapur I, also known as Shvur Malka. He appears every now and then in the Talmudic literature. And it represents a period where the Jews seem to have, for the most part, a tremendous amount of freedom of activity, that they have a widespread settlement in one concentrated area, particularly on the banks of the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, and they're able to engage in tremendous internal creativity. And it will remain this way until the Muslim conquest in the 7th century, and then things are going to shift, just like we saw shifting from the Tanaim to the Amoraim. Then we begin to have a different kind of intellectual orientation once the Talmud is solidified in its format, but let me leave that till later on. Here's a map that shows where the Jews were settled. If you look on the right-hand side, you can see the larger scale, the two major rivers, in Hebrew the Nahar Diglat, or Hidekel, which is the Tigris, and the Nahar Prat, or the Euphrates, and they flow from the northwest down into the southeast, into the Persian Gulf. And there's a region at the waist of those rivers where they come together. That's where Jews were primarily settled. And there's much older settlements of Jews that we can trace in biblical literature, for example, but this is really where the heavy settlement exists in the Talmudic period. Now, in this particular map, it's called the area of pure lineage. You can see in the detail on the left there. And this is a determination that was made in the Talmud in one particular discussion about marrying Jews who come from faraway lands, where there is a question of rates of intermarriage and of following divorce law appropriately, which has great significance in Jewish thought. You can see here, though, the number of small towns that are actually referred to several times in the Talmud, but they're all based on these two big rivers with canals that run between them. Here's a Hebrew map that I think condenses some of this information to some of the most important sites. You have the great yeshiva at Sura, the great academy at Sura, at Nehardea, and at Pumbedita. The story of these three yeshivot, and after the year 259, when Nehardea is overrun in a regional conflict of two yeshivot, Sura and Pumbedita, will last for hundreds of years and extend well into the Muslim period. These are the great academies, the centers of Jewish study, where the Talmud would be developed in Babylonia. And what I think is especially fascinating about this map is that if you look at the scale, you can see that it's 50 kilometers basically between each of these yeshivot. 50 kilometers in miles is something like 30 miles. Like conceivably, you could walk along the riverbank all the way from Sura to Pumbedita in one long day. Certainly, you could stop in Nehardea for a lunch and maybe stay the night and then walk into Pumbedita and have lunch there the next day. It's amazing how we're talking about places that have such phenomenal global significance for Jews studying the Talmud, but they're really so close to each other, even by foot. And the historical element of this is that when Rav came back from studying with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and others in Israel, when he returned to Bavel, he ended up establishing the yeshiva of Sura. His colleague Shmuel went to Nehardea, and later the yeshiva moved to Pumbedita, and that's how we have these major institutions. There are many, many others as well, but these are, let's say, the three really big early yeshivot established in the region. A lot more to say about what exactly was a yeshiva. We tend to think of contemporary yeshivot and, fold them backwards in time to what they must have looked like then. Possibly it didn't look like that much at all. It may have been more like disciple circles or things like that. But we do know that there were three kind of institutional settings that were especially important in the early period. Rabbis, by and large, are not really interested in giving us extraneous information that we might like as historians. They give us a lot of description about law, religion, philosophy, things like that, but not necessarily history. And when scholars begin to discover a little evidence recorded in non-Jewish sources or perhaps archaeological evidence, it's absolutely fantastic and amazing. Like, for example, this is a curse bowl. There are literally hundreds of curse bowls that were recently discovered in the region. It has a demon at the center, and it appears that these bowls were used in kind of like folk magic, that somehow Jews would produce these devices. It seems that they may have been, broken apart as a form of affecting a kind of a curse or something on one's enemies, things like that. But what's fascinating is that a lot of the personal names that are listed here are clearly not Jewish names, but local Babylonian names. So it may be that Jews were, they had cornered the market in curse bowls and they were selling them to everybody there. We don't know for sure, but it's fascinating to see little bits of what culture must have been like outside of the yeshiva, for which we have all kinds of data. We know, again, primarily from the Talmudic sources, that there was a form of organization of the kind of self-government of the Jews in Babylonia at this time. It's not entirely clear how effective that government was. We know that it did enjoy some recognition from the regal power, meaning there was the Jews did have some kind of self-government, which did have official standing to some degree or another with the royal kingdom. It was led by someone called the Exilarch, or in Aramaic, the Reish Galuta, the head of the exile, probably modeled on the patriarchate in Israel. Just like Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was a descendant of King David and had that unique leadership role, so too the Exilarch was reputed to be from the line of King David, and so on. There is a significant amount of doubt among scholars as to when the Exilarchate actually began. We sort of lose track of reliable data in the Parthian period, but certainly in the Sasanian period you have the Reish Galuta. They're named, they interact with rabbis in the Talmud, and so on. There's also a lot of people who are active in the area, and we only catch glimpses of them because our main lens is through the rabbinic view of the world. So we've already talked about Bruria as one of the exceptional women of the Talmud because she was so learned. We also have, however, a few other women that occur, like Yalta, who was a very learned and opinionated woman. She is associated with medicine as well, so it could be that she was representative of women who had some healing professions outside of what might have been normally considered a women's domain. We really don't know for detail. And we have some really touching portraits of women, like, for example, the otherwise unnamed mother of Abaye, who wasn't actually his mother because his mother died in childbirth. He was an orphan raised by an uncle. But the woman who was his stepmother, who cared for him, he always referred to her as Ima. And on many occasions, Abaye, the great rabbi, very important rabbi in the Talmud, one of the most important, will refer to teachings of his own mother and say, Amra li aim, my mother said to me, indicating that he had a high regard for her as a person and as a person of knowledge. Fascinating, but just tantalizing bits of detail. We also have lots of fascinating non-Jews in the Talmud as well. The Magi, I was just learning a passage with Magi today. These are, of course, important in Christian tradition. They are the Magi come to visit, and they come far away from the east, drawn by the star, things like that. The gift of the Magi, the important O. Henry story. But the Magi are Zoroastrian priests who often mess around with the Jews. There's a lot of conflict with the Jews in the Talmudic period over things like the use of fire. Casual use of fire was something that was frowned upon by the Zoroastrians, particularly on specific days of the calendar. The Mishnah in Shabbos, for example, which is read every Friday night in the Ashkenazic ritual, refers to Jews who put out their candles on Friday night because they are afraid of the Magi. That's not the term used there, but if you see the commentaries, you'll see that's exactly what they're talking about. So also because the Magi regard the fire as having tremendous sanctity, and it was like a purifying force. The Magi were also very concerned about issues of, defiling the earth. And so they frowned upon burial, Jewish burial. Some conflict erupted over those kinds of things. So the Talmud gives us one look at the outside world, and it is an extremely rich and detailed look, but only from that one perspective. And a lot of data that we would have liked to have had just doesn't come through because it's not considered a relevant data point.
Now, it's interesting that the Jews used the word Qur'an themselves to denote the Jewish scripture, and I take this from Lloyd de Young's presentation on this. The linguistic and conceptual parallel between Qur'an and Mikra as divine revelation was clear both to Muslims and to their Jewish neighbours. Since Arabic was their mother tongue, Jewish scholars in Muslim lands often wrote in that language or translated their Hebrew writings into Arabic, even when expounding the Hebrew scriptures. Thus, the 10th century scholar Sa'adia Gaon, in his treatise on the 70 Hapax Legomena of the Mikra, even uses the term Qur'an to denote the Jewish scripture. This could be an interesting clue for later. The correspondence between Qur'an and Mikra as the first root of law is seen also in parallel terminology for the two revelations as Holy Writ. The Qur'an frequently calls itself Al-Kitab, literally the writing, and uses the same term to denote the Hebrew scripture. So let's keep that in mind, that Jews use the word Qur'an to refer to their own scripture, and perhaps at an earlier time in history, when Jewish leaders were focusing on writing the Talmud, they were using that word Qur'an for their own scripture as well. It's not necessarily that they've just copied Islam. It could be that this word was used by both, because the people in Babylon were multilingual. They spoke Aramaic, they spoke Hebrew, they spoke Arabic. So we need to keep an open mind on all of this. So let's go a little bit deeper.
But what I'm going to focus on in particular is what's happening just to the right of the map. You can see there that kind of purple jagged line represents the edge of the Roman Empire. It would be split into its western and eastern sections. What's happening on the eastern side of that jagged line? That's essentially the region of Mesopotamia, or Babylonia, where there's a very significant Jewish population, and that's where the Babylonian Talmud would be written. Here's another map that shows you the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire, which dominated Persia and the entire region at this time. It existed right up until the 3rd century, and Rome and the Parthian Empire are at loggerheads, and their successors, the Sassanids, would also follow in that conflict with Rome. What's going to be relevant for us today is that we're going to be discussing the history of communities primarily in the Parthian and Sasanian Empire on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire. And they developed very, very differently in many ways. Let's have a look at the academies as we understand them. So we've already talked quite a bit about the academies on the western region, what in fact the Talmud calls the yeshivas of the West. This map here shows you the two major population centers of Jews in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Of course, obviously the land of which has a lot of Jews living there. Some of the highlighted words like Tel Aviv was not a city back then, of course, but it's placed there for some sense of geography, and that's where most of the Jews, of course, were living in the first century. But there's a significant population way out to the right-hand side of this map, where the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers come together. This is the locale of ancient Babylonia, where the Jews were first exiled to in the 6th century before the Common Era. Now, it's interesting because in many ways this was the original home of the Israelites, because Abraham actually comes from this region. He's called the Ivri, the one who crosses over, because he crossed the Euphrates River on his way to the land of Israel, as described in the book of Genesis. But this becomes a major center of Jewish population really only in the 6th century before the Common Era, when the Neo-Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar exiles a large population of the Jews from the southern region of Judah into Babylonia. And they establish, quite a community there. And there's some significant and really fascinating archaeological evidence that emerges from this period that shows the Jews thriving as a people in this region. They would eventually be allowed to return under Cyrus later in the 6th century, and they would reestablish their community in the land of Israel, as we discussed in a recent video. But they would remain as well in Babylonia and continue to flourish. One of the oldest Jewish communities in the world is located here because of that 6th century exile. And that's where the Talmud would be written. But before that, let's just quickly go back and remember the Jerusalem Talmud, which preceded the Babylonian Talmud. As we discussed in a couple of videos ago, it's primarily the work of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. They are the most prominent rabbis in this massive discussion of things biblical and things Mishnaic. I'll get back to that in a little while. But there's a lot of political difficulty in the 4th century in particular. Although there was a period when the Roman Empire was led by the Antonine and the Severan dynasties, where Jews had a little bit of a relaxation of the persecution that followed the 2 disastrous Roman-Jewish wars, that begins to turn in the 4th century, in large part because of the Edict of Milan and all that signifies. There would be a revolt in the middle of the 4th century against a Roman governor named Gallus, and that would be put down quite harshly by the Romans. But it is at this time, immediately after the revolt against Gallus, that there seems to be a concerted effort to try and gather up all of the intellectual fragments that went together to make up the body of learning that would have ultimately become the Jerusalem Talmud. So that's all happening in the 4th century. There are some scholars who suspect that the Jerusalem Talmud has a different character because the editing process was rather rushed in comparison to Babylonia, where the Jews had actually quite a bit more, a longer duration of peace, and that allowed them to refine the text. But at any rate, that's when the Jerusalem Talmud emerges. If we move over to the Mesopotamian region, we see that there are a few key events. One of them that's really crucial is the arrival in the region of an individual who was known by the name Rav. It's actually a title. It means the teacher. He came from Israel in the year 219 of the Common Era. He was actually a native of Babylonia who had studied in Israel and brought back some of the teachings that were going on in the land of Israel. And he was perhaps the first of a whole class of peripatetic rabbis who would move between Babylonia and Israel, sharing the results of the deliberations in their academies. These were the so-called nechute, which means those who go down. It refers specifically to those who leave from the land of Israel, which is metaphorically considered higher in elevation, and so they went down to the land of Babylonia and shared what they learned there. But there was also cross-fertilization going back to Jerusalem for basically 200 years. There is much more of a relaxed environment for the Jews living in Babylonia. There were a few moments of persecution, sometimes associated with the rise of the Zoroastrians. That's sometimes reflected in the texts of the Talmud. And there is, every now and then it's punctuated by violent conflict as a result of that Roman-Persian war that's going on for centuries. One of the most important moments of disruption that specifically targets the city of Nehardea, one of the great centers of the Babylonian Talmud researchers was when a figure named Odenatus Septinus, who came from the region of Palmyra up to the northwest, and he came down into this region and he destroyed Nahar in the year 259. That caused a lot of the scholars there to be displaced to some of the other great yeshivas. Perhaps the two most significant are shown here on this map, Pumbedita and Sura. They had a rivalry that went on for literally centuries for which yeshiva, which center of learning would be the most significant. About the origins of the Babylonian Jewish community, I've given you a little bit of some of the relationship of the thinkers, the rabbis who created the Talmud to their predecessors in the land of Israel, and we've talked, of course, about the Jerusalem Talmud. Let us now turn to the Babylonian Talmud itself. What exactly is it? Now, it's a massive document. In the current standard printed edition, it takes up 2,711 folios. That means 2 sides of 1 page, so about 5,500 pages. The reason why I happen to know that number offhand, 2,711, is because, of course, there is this really popular study group, sometimes called the world's largest book club, called Daf Yomi, which means literally a folio a day. It was started in the 1920s, and basically all around the world, Jews who are interested in the Talmud, and I assume some non-Jews as well, study 1 page a day of this massive document, and they conclude it every 7.5 years. It's a rather amazing event, and you can travel all around the world and pick up the page that you were missing from the day prior. It's fascinating. So it's this huge document. It's written, as I mentioned, largely in Aramaic, although it quotes heavily from Hebrew sources, most significantly the Mishnah, and I'll talk about that again in a second. And it also has influence of, you'll see Greek words in there, Latin words in there, Persian words in there, all, showing how this is a multi-generational document that was literally composed by about 2,000 different authors. These are primarily rabbis, religious experts, who are debating this core text called the Mishnah, which we have discussed in a previous video. I encourage you to go back there and have a look if you're curious. But basically, the Mishnah is sort of a companion to the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses. In traditional Jewish thought, both the written Torah that exists in the biblical form that many Jews revere today was given alongside an oral body of teachings. So this is the written Torah and the oral Torah. And those oral teachings were eventually codified into text, and one of those major texts is the Mishnah, which was codified around the year 200 and basically deals with aspects of Jewish law and behavior. It's a kind of a bizarre text by modern standards. It's not a law code. It's not a list of rules. It's sort of like icebreaker conversations to talk about, how does one actually live according to the Torah. And the discussions often do not come to a clear conclusion, and so it sort of requires further involvement in the text. This further involvement of living students literally talking and speaking about what this means and debating with each other was eventually codified into a series of conversations which we call the Talmud. That's basically it is. There's also, by the way, the word Talmud, which means the learning, is identical with something called the Gemara, which means the finishing. But it's basically a super discussion of the discussion in the Mishnah, which is itself connected to the Torah. Not a precise analogy, but if the Mishnah is sort of like a commentary in the Talmud, it's not exactly a commentary because there's a lot of things that discussed in the Mishnah which are not made explicit in the Torah, but there's kind of like parallel texts. So if the Mishnah is sort of a commentary on the Torah, the Talmud can be understood as sort of a commentary on the Mishnah. That's basically what it does. That's its function. The bottom line of the Talmud is it gives an opportunity for the students of the Torah to engage in a wide-ranging discussion of what it means to follow a particular commandment. What are the parameters of that commandment? Who is obligated to follow the commandment? Are there exceptions? All kinds of things are discussed in the Talmud this way. Now, you might wonder, if it's an open-ended discussion, why is it codified in the first place? Why not just keep it going on and on? Well, on one level, it does go on and on because the commentaries like Rashi and Tosfot and others continue the discussion much further, right up into the 21st century. But on another level, it's kind of like these are the guardrails for a productive discussion of the Torah. Kind of like, this is maybe not the right analogy, but sometimes I wonder, I see kids, they like to sometimes watch recordings of other people playing video games. And you say, like, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you want to play the video game on your own? But apparently it's deeply satisfying to see how someone else succeeds or fails in these video games. So not the greatest of analogies, but I think the idea is that Talmud allows you to follow the discussion of a group of really incredible minds, refined over time by later minds who codified their language into a very compact form. But it's all about, how do we observe these commandments? What is its significance? It's massively significant. It becomes, after it is, codified around the year 500, it becomes the central go-to text for Jews who really want to understand, why do we do the things we do? Should we be doing them exactly the way we're doing them? Any authoritative thinker in Judaism must go through the arguments of the Talmud in order to understand why these particular practices are adopted, why others are not adopted, and so on. And since the Talmud is such a crucial document dealing primarily with Jewish law, lots of other really useful information, which appears, only lightly connected to the material sometimes, almost tangential to the material, is included in there. So, for example, the whole, philosophy of the afterlife and good and evil and reward and punishment and all kinds of philosophical things are piled into the Talmud as well. It is, by a Western sensibility, after reading Greek texts and the Western canon, it seems like a chaotic kind of document. It's really not, but it is definitely not arranged on Western lines. You follow these discussions through many, many different areas of thought. Every page is completely refreshed and completely new and really quite a fascinating document. You can understand why Daf Yomi is really such a popular program.
Now, this term, Geonim, that's the plural. It's also transliterated with the spelling Gaonim, as you can see there, and Geon singular. These were the presidents of the two great Babylonian Talmudic Academies of Sura and Pompedita in the Abbasid Caliphate. They were generally accepted as the spiritual leaders of the Jewish community worldwide in the early medieval era, in contrast to the Resh Galuta, the Exilarch, who wielded secular authority over the Jews in Islamic lands. So you can see there's a pair there. You have the spiritual side and you have the secular side, and they're working around each other, as it were. Geonim is the plural of Geon, as we've just mentioned, which means pride or splendor in biblical Hebrew, and since the 19th century, genius, as in modern Hebrew. Now you notice I have question marks there. I have a sneaking suspicion that the sense of genius was there much earlier. Are they trying to hide a little bit of that early connection of the meaning? I know that sounds like a bit of a conspiracy, but when we look at some other elements of the story later on, you might be forgiven to think that, well, maybe that sense was there as well in earlier times. So put it down as a hunch for now. As the title of a Babylonian college president, it meant something like His Excellency. The Geonim played a prominent and decisive role in the transmission and teaching of Torah and Jewish law. They taught Talmud and decided on issues on which no ruling had been rendered during the period of the Talmud. Now, if you look at the chart there, you get a good sense of when the Babylonian Talmud was being written. And isn't it interesting, if you look at that red line, that a good chunk of that red line is actually also the period in which the Qur'an is also being put together. That's no accident, no coincidence. So these are contemporary with each other. And I would argue they both have quite a long gestation period as well in terms of them being put together. Okay. So let's look at that word Geon again. So what we mean by it is a Jewish head of one of the Babylonian Academies at Sura and Pompedita from about AD 589 to 1038, and usually an eminent religious scholar and judicial authority, and it's used as a title of honor, an outstanding intellectual and Talmudic scholar. To be able to get to grips with the Talmud required years and years of study. You needed to be able to speak a number of different languages. You needed to know the Bible extremely well. You needed to know the teaching of the various sages down through Jewish history and many other disciplines as well. This is not something that you can do just simply orally. It requires deep reading of the text, as I said, in multiple languages. This is really important. Now, there is that motif of the illiterate prophet. Well, when we're dealing with things like the Talmud, there's no room for that. You cannot get away with being an illiterate when dealing with such heavy content as this. Content that has many layers to it and requires extensive study, and not just individual study, but study within the community, and the community passes on its knowledge and wisdom down through the generations. It is heavy going, heavy study. It's an oral tradition and a written tradition combined. Now, a little bit further about that word Geon in terms of its etymology. Okay, so grandeur, majesty, and genius. Okay. The word genius jumped out at me when I looked at it. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. Now, the Arabian Nights of all things. Why would I possibly want to look at the Arabian Nights? Well, there's something interesting that I noticed about the Arabian Nights. The Arabian Nights, also known as 1001 Nights, is a collection of Middle Eastern and South Asian stories and folk tales compiled in Arabic during the Islamic Golden Age, which is from the 8th to the 13th centuries. So this is in the same period as when the Babylonian Talmud was being produced. And the thing with stories is it can often pick up on hidden things, or stories or events that are often coded and put symbolically into stories, adding a deeper layer to the story, and to people in the know a little bit more entertaining when they know what is being referenced. The stories were collected over many centuries by various authors, translators, and scholars across West Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, and North Africa. The tales were first translated into English in the early 18th century by Antoine Galland. It is often known in English as the Arabian Nights from the first English language edition, which was done in 1706 to 1721, which rendered the title as the Arabian Nights Entertainment. The origin of the stories is not entirely clear. Some scholars believe that the tales originated in India and Persia and were eventually translated into Arabic under the name Alf Layla, or the Thousand Nights. Others suggest that the stories were originally told in Arabic and Persian before being translated into other languages. In any case, even if they had originated in India, the stories contain characters and events which centered on Baghdad and various other locations, and a time that fitted with the golden age of Islam. The tales themselves feature a wide range of characters from different backgrounds and cultures. Some of the most famous characters include, and we'll look at each of these in turn because there's some fascinating little links and connections here with all of this. So we take Aladdin, a poor young man who discovers a magic lamp containing a genie that can grant wishes. And then there's Ali Baba, a poor woodcutter who discovers a secret cave filled with treasure belonging to a group of robbers. And then there's Sinbad, a sailor who embarks on 7 voyages to different parts of the world. And then there's Harun al-Rashid. Well, actually, he's a historical figure. He's the Caliph, a historical Abbasid Caliph who appears in several stories. And then there's Abu Nuwas, a famous poet who also appears in several stories. So these are really interesting figures in the stories. Some of them fictional, some are real people, but they have symbolic significance. And even though the stories were retold and changed over the centuries, there could be some little symbolic nuggets contained even in their names. So let's see what we can come up with here. So Ali Baba. So obviously Ali is associated with Iraq. The famous Ali, of course, is Ali ibn Abi Talib, supposedly born 600 AD in Mecca, Arabia, and died in January 661 in Kufa, Iraq. And that word Baba is interesting. Its meaning, well, depends where you look. Usually considered a borrowing from Aramaic, which would mean gate, or from Akkadian, again, Baboon, gate. However, in Old Persian, Baba means father and is linguistically related to the common European word papa and the word pope, having the same Indo-European origin. Okay? So Father Ali, Ali Baba, Father Abu, Father Ali. So let's go a little bit deeper. What about Babai the Great? Now, he lived, as you may remember, in the 7th century. And the word Babai is related to that word we saw a second ago, which meant gate. Okay? Possibly it also had the sense of father, but I think it was gate, if I'm not mistaken. So Babai the Great was born in Bet Ainata in Bet Zabde on the west bank of the Tigris near Nisibis, which is there in the red rectangle. When the Catholicos Gregorius died in 608, the bishops made the usual request to the king to allow them to elect a new Catholicos, which is kind of like their pope. But Khosrow refused them leave to do so. Babai was made regent instead until the year of Khosrow's death in 628. Now, while we have the map here, if you look down towards the bottom of the map, you'll see a number of Jewish academies. Okay, so you'll see Pompedita there, and you'll see Naharda, and you should be able to see Surah as well. And for good measure, you also see a Christian center, which is Al-Hira. Okay, now in terms of the rivers, you have the Euphrates is the one which is sort of to the left, going from northwest to southeast, and then the Tigris is parallel, more or less, east of there. So just so we're clear. Okay, so you can see there's quite a clump of Jewish academies way down in the south, and that's where all the action is. All right. What about Abu Nuwas? Well, Abu Nuwas was an Arab poet who lived during the 8th century Islamic Golden Age. He was born in Avaz, a city in modern-day Iran, and died in Baghdad around 814. Abu Nuwas is known for his homoerotic poetry, which was openly circulated until the 20th century. He collected poems or diwan includes around 1,500 works that explore pleasure, sexuality, and religion. Who'd have thought that someone in the 9th century would be creating homoerotic poetry? Well, when you look at the hadiths from that period, you also see an amazing fascination with all types of sexualities, often licentious. So it kind of fits in with the picture we get of that time. So an interesting person. I'm sure there's a lot more to be found out about him. Now we also have a reference to Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp. You might think Aladdin finds a lamp, rubs it, and a genie pops out to grant him 3 wishes. In the original tale, though, there are actually 2 genies, one bound to a magic ring and one found inside a lamp. Both are summoned by accident, and both vow to obey their master in all things. Now, you noticed earlier on that we mentioned that the Jewish leaders were divided among the Geon, or the Geonim, the plural, who are the spiritual leaders, and we also saw that they had a secular leader, which was the Exilarch. Now, isn't it interesting here that you also have 2 genies originally, and the symbolism there, one had a magic ring, and one was found inside a lamp. Magic ring. I wonder could that be a reference to the Exilarch, who has the magic ring, the secular authority, and the other, the spiritual one, would be the one inside a lamp. Just a thought that occurs to me. Obviously, we're just thinking openly here and speculating. We're not necessarily ironing this down or nailing this down just yet. We're just having a free-flowing conversation and a thought experiment, as it were. Let's go a little bit further. The Arabian Nights, the story of the fisherman. The story of the fisherman is one of the earlier tales from Arabian Nights. It seems to be one of the first instances of a genie or jinn appearing to a person after being freed from a bottle. In this tale, there's no rubbing of a lamp or wish granting, just a man outwitting an all-powerful and ancient jinn who has vowed to kill the fisherman. There's definitely a lot of mythos in this, a lot of symbolic references, so it's fascinating. Obviously, the sense of what it all meant has been lost, but it's still a great story. The actual origin of the genie in the lamp granting 3 wishes was a symbol from a variety of different sources. Arabian Nights introduced people to powerful genies bound to mysterious lamps. This idea combined with other fables to add the "be careful what you wish for" moral of the tales we are so familiar with today. Now, the Latin word genius. The origin of the word genie is from the Latin genius, meaning a tutelary spirit. Isn't that interesting? So, in Latin, the word genius means obviously someone who's very clever, but it also has the meaning of a guardian spirit. Sounds a little bit like a jinn, doesn't it? However, the concept of a genie as an evil spirit that can shapeshift and inhabit non-living things is from the Arabic genie, which is the singular of jinn. The French translation of Arabian Nights used the word genie to render genie, and if I'm pronouncing that correctly, genie. And this usage was adopted in English from 1748. So I can hear the linguists going crazy with all of this at the minute. But if you can look at language playfully and see how words can have can alternate between different languages, and people can have a bit of fun with language, it is interesting that they use the word genius, like a tutelary spirit, for that genie in the bottle, as it were. Okay, so now Tutlery there, a protector or guardian or patron okay, that's the meaning of that one. Is the gain, genius, linked with the other Latin word genius? This is the thing that kind of jumps out at me. What do you think? Is there some link there? It's interesting, isn't it? We'll come back to that. Let's look at the meaning of the word Aladdin. Okay, so Allah or Allah is an Arabic male given name meaning elevation, exaltedness, highness, loftiness, sublimity or honour and glory, might, power, dignity or prestige, greatness, noble, high in rank or eminence, glorious, grandeur or high in position and status. So one example in history would be Ala al-Din Hussein, who was a king of the Hurid dynasty from 1149 to 1161. Okay, so notice Ala al-Din and Aladdin, they're actually the same word. Okay, so al-Din literally means of the religion, faith or creed. Okay, for example, Saif al-Din. All right, Aladdin, commonly Ala-ud-Din or Ala-ad-Din, is a male given name which means nobility of faith or nobility of creed, religion. It is one of a large class of names ending with Adin. So Aladdin is actually a symbolic name, okay, full of meaning, nobility of creed or faith, okay, or religion. Is Aladdin named after an historical figure? I don't think so. In terms of the story, it's not, to me it doesn't seem like it. I think it's just a symbolic idea that is contained in the character of Aladdin. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is that Aladdin comes from a Maronite storyteller. Known along with Ali Baba as one of the orphan tales, the story was not part of the original Nights collection and has no authentic Arabic textual source, but was incorporated into the book Les Mille et Une Nuits by its French translator Antoine Galland. John Payne quotes passages from Galland's unpublished diary, recording Galland's encounter with a Maronite storyteller from Aleppo, Hannah Diab. According to Galland's diary, he met with Hannah, who had travelled from Aleppo to Paris with celebrated French traveller Paul Lucas on March the 25th, 1709. Galland's diary further reports that his transcription of Aladdin for publication occurred in the winter of 1709 to 10. It was included in his volumes 9 and 10 of the Nights, published in 1710, without any mention or published acknowledgement of Hannah's contribution. Okay, so it's very important to point out that, the Aladdin part and the Ali Baba part is a later addition. Where it came from originally, was it completely from Hannah Diab's imagination, or did he inherit stories in the oral traditions that passed down the line? Was it just an act of genius on his part to come up with these characters and place them in the Islamic Golden Age, and they fit in really well with that in terms of time and place, etc. So I don't know. There's something about those names that there's a lot of knowledge behind Hannah Diab's names and stories. I think there's more to it. There's more to it. As when you see his biography, he's no fool. He knows things, let's say. That's what I feel about it. Okay, so let's look a little deeper into his story. Okay, so he's born in 1688. He was a Syrian Maronite writer and storyteller. He originated the best-known versions of the tales of Aladdin and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, which have been added to the 1001 Nights since French Orientalist Antoine Galland translated and included them, after which they soon became popular across the West. So if we just pop down further, recent reassessments of Diab's contribution to Les Mille et Une Nuits, Gallon's hugely influential version of the Arabic 1001 Nights, have argued that his artistry is central to the literary history of such famous tales as Aladdin and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, despite Diab never being named in Gallon's publications. Diab should be understood as the original author of some of the stories he supplied, according to Ruth Botti Gemmer and Paulo Lemos Horta, and even that several of Diab's stories, including Aladdin, were partially inspired by Diab's own life, as there are parallels with his autobiography. Okay, so the mystery deepens here in terms of this character. Most of what is known about Diab's life comes from his autobiography, which he composed in 1763 at the age of around 75. It survives as Vatican Library MS Sabbat 254, though the first few pages are missing, and its lively narrative have been described as picaresque and a valuable example of the colloquial 18th century Middle Arabic of Aleppo, and influenced by Aramaic and Turkish. This guy knows quite a bit in terms of language. Focusing on his travels from 1707 to 1710, it provides an outsider's view of Paris in 1708 to 1709, as well as extensive glimpses into other aspects of Diab's world, though it may not only reflect Diab's eyewitness experiences, but also his literary knowledge of the places and cultures he encountered and his identity as a raconteur. Other details of Diab's life are known from the diaries of Antoine Galland, Diab's marriage contract of 1770, and an Aleppo census of 1740. So in terms of his early life, he was born to a Maronite Christian family in Aleppo around 1688. Working as a young man for French merchants in Syria, he learned French and Italian. He also had a knowledge of Provençal and Turkish. It's also possible that he knew some Syriac. And he even had a reception at Versailles in the apartments of Louis XIV. So, a very interesting character. While in Paris, Diab first met the Orientalist Antoine Galland. And what's sad about his story is that he received no credit in Galland's published work, nor any mention in the writing of Lucas, which is a real shame. Now, there's also, in case it seems that, these stories are innocent and there's no links, deeper links, there is a paper by Amir Lerner titled The Story of the Vizier and His Son from the 101 Nights, Parallels in Midrashic Literature and Backgrounds in Early Arabic Sources. So there's actually a lot of reference to Jewish literature in these stories, so they're not as straightforward as you might think. There is grounds for thinking that there's more to these stories than meet the eye. Now, so that's the Aladdin side of things. It's interesting, the symbolism of that name, and whether Diab was conscious of what he was doing or not. Did he have some story that came down that he kind of remastered? But that interesting name, Aladdin, that was a bit of genius there. Let's move on to another character that's referred to in the Arabian Nights, which is Harun al-Rashid, 1786 to 1809. Now, you may remember that he was the husband of the queen who built the aqueducts to feed the water to Mecca, which were completed in 801, without which you couldn't support the pilgrims there. So they, he's pretty critical to the development of Mecca, to put it mildly. Under the Abbasid Caliphs, according to Arab tradition, the town of Baghdad was founded in the middle of the 8th century by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur. According to Jewish to the Jewish Encyclopedia, the fact that a Babylonian city named Baghdad is already mentioned in the Talmud suggests that the Caliph Mansur only rebuilt and enlarged the older Persian city of Baghdad. That Baghdad was originally a Persian city is indicated by the name, which is thought to be of Persian origin. Situated on the left bank of the Tigris, the town was in close proximity to the two centers of Jewish spiritual life, Sura and Pompadita. As the Caliph was anxious to see the population of his new residence increase, he offered no resistance to Jews settling there and forming a community. They became so numerous that one of the bridges over the Karkaya in the western suburb was called Kantara al-Yahud, or Jews Bridge. Yaqut al-Hamawi mentions that the Jewish quarter, the Dar al-Yahud, was in the neighbourhood. The Jews were occasionally troubled by revivals of the restrictions on non-Muslims. These regulations were first renewed by Harun al-Rashid, who ordered that Jews and Christians should wear distinguishing marks on their clothing, refrain from riding on horseback, and suffer other similar humiliations. These restrictions were later relaxed, but were again imposed by al-Mutawakkil in 880, who went so far as to convert the synagogues into mosques. Jews did, however, hold state offices under al-Mutadid. Now, this here is focusing on the idea that Baghdad was linked with Pompadita. As the seat of the Caliphate, Baghdad quickly gained prominence. It was a home for Jewish learning, and a number of prominent individuals lived there. Aaron bin Samuel Nasi of Babylon, the mystic of the 9th century, came to Italy. It is often mentioned at this time under the name of Babylon. Baghdad belonged rather to Pompadita Academy than to Sura Academy. Who were the Gaons during Harun al-Rashid's reign? Or I should say the Geonim. Who were the Geonim during Harun al-Rashid's reign? Right, so here they are. These are various names. Unfortunately, I couldn't get any great info on any of these, but these are the Gaons during that time, and maybe these will become significant for us later. But for now, we can leave those aside. These are Surah's deans, as it were. And in Pompadita, we have these leaders. These are the Geonim during the similar period. Okay. Now, Baghdad is mentioned in the Talmud. Now, if we remember that the Talmud was being written from the early part of the 7th century and completed around 1000 AD. Okay. So it is interesting to see that Baghdad is mentioned in the Talmud, probably because it's contemporary with it, but it probably was there before the Talmud was started, perhaps. It's hard to say, but you can see the reference there to Rav Hana of Baghdad. Okay. Now, moving on, we have Sinbad the sailor. Okay. The etymology is borrowed from Arabic, from Middle Persian. Sinbad, possibly borrowed from Sanskrit, which Siddhapata, Path of the Blessed. Again, that's a very symbolic name, kind of religious symbolism there to it. Sinbad the sailor is a fictional mariner and the hero of a story cycle. He is described as hailing from Baghdad during the early Abbasid Caliphate. In the course of 7 voyages throughout the seas east of Africa and south of Asia, he has fantastic adventures in magical realms, encountering monsters and witnessing supernatural phenomena. And I should say, I loved these stories when I was growing up. Very, very nice stories, particularly for kids. Now, the tales of Sinbad are a relatively late addition to 1001 Nights. They do not feature in the earliest 14th century manuscript, and they appear as an independent cycle in 18th to 19th century collections. the tale reflects the trend within the Abbasid realm of Arab and Muslim sailors exploring the world. The stories display the folk themes present in works of that time. The Abbasid reign was known as a period of great economic and social growth. Arab and Muslim traders would seek new trading routes and people to trade with. This process of growth is reflected in the Sinbad tales. The Sinbad stories take on a variety of different themes. Later sources include Abbasid works such as The Wonders of the Created World, reflecting the experiences of 13th century Arab mariners who braved the Indian Ocean. The Sinbad cycle is set in the reign of the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid. Why is Harun al-Rashid so important to these stories and so central? There's something there. I think his importance largely is to do with Mecca's aqueducts, but it could be also the fact that he and his wife encouraged rationality and reason, at least for a time, and this led to social progress and developments and so forth. So it could be largely to do with that. It was a positive period. The Sinbad tales are included in the first European translation of the Nights, and I think I've covered that already, so I won't repeat myself. Now, next thing I'm going to be looking at is examples of interaction between Islamic writings and the Talmud. And if you remember, not so long ago, we had a visitor onto the channel called Sasha, and he gave us some of these examples. In fact, he gave us a lot more examples. But I want to draw your attention to how both the Hadiths and the Qur'an are clearly conscious and interacting with the Talmud. Okay? This is interesting. Why is that happening? I thought the Qur'an was written way down in an isolated part of Arabia, away from the away from the Jewish Academies and so forth. But yes, it sounds remarkably like it's engaging with a local academy. Good. Anyway, let's start with the Hadith. So this one says, "My mercy prevails over my wrath." Okay. Let's look at Barakat 7a. Rabbi Yossi says, "From where it is derived from the Holy One, blessed be he prays," and so on. Let's go down near the bottom, and you can see it says, "May it be my will that my mercy will overcome my anger." Do you see that? My mercy prevails over my wrath. So there's an obvious awareness and nodding knowledge of the Talmud there in the Hadith. Okay. Let's take another example. Now this is from the Qur'an. Surah 6, Ayah 101. "How could he have a son when he does not have a companion?" Okay, that old chestnut. I wonder, would it be in the Talmud? Is it possible? Could an illiterate prophet in the middle of nowhere happen to magically come up with something that's in the Talmud? Surely not. Surely an illiterate person wouldn't be able to know of things hidden in hundreds of pages of a book. Oh, here it is. Okay, a clear reference in Hohet Rabbah 4:8. "There is one and not another. He also has no son or brother. He also has no son or brother. If he has no brother, from where would he have a son?" And it goes into a little bit more detail there. So there's definitely a parallel between the two passages. There's an allusion to it there. So, if we think back at that ayah that we began with, why don't we just reconsider that word gen? "Say, O Prophet, it has been revealed to me that a group of Geonim listened to the Qur'an and said to their fellow Geonim, 'Indeed, we have heard a wondrous recitation.'" Now we're in the world of reality. We're dealing with something that we can see what is being referred to. We're not really talking about spiritual beings, but actually just a group of Jewish leaders here, the Geonim. The Geonim listened to the Qur'an. What is the Qur'an? The Jewish scripture. And said to their fellow Geonim, indeed, we have heard a wondrous recitation. So, what do you think? Is there something in this? I think this makes a lot more sense of that Quranic passage, and there's many others that refer to the Jinn. Now that we know that both of those words have an overlap in meaning, the idea of genius, the Latin word genius actually means a spirit, a protective spirit, and also, carries the idea of genius that we think of in English today. So it's interesting, isn't it? Now, what about that genie in the bottle then? And Aladdin. Aladdin is the name that symbolizes nobility of faith. And if the genie is the Geon, that's the leader of the Jewish Academy, what is his lamp? He is inside the lamp. What is the lamp? The lamp of knowledge. He has the light. And in order to grasp the nobility of the faith, the Aladdin, one must rub the lamp. Does that make sense? That's my sense of it. Now, how it was that the story of Aladdin was included and having kind of a sense that fits with the 8th and 9th century, that's a mystery. Maybe there's something in the oral tradition that came down there, but I think there's something here in this. The Jinn are really the Geon, the Jewish leaders. Now we can see why the Qur'an seems to be crossed with the Jinn. What do you think? So leave your comments below. I hope you found this interesting. It is just an idea. I'm putting it out there. I'm sure we're going to be coming back to the concept of the Jewish Academies later again, because I think there's more to this. But I hope you found this enlightening. And thank you for watching. See you all very soon. Bye-bye.